Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a giant. Albert Einstein. Everyone knows the name, the hair, maybe EMC squared.
Absolutely. Hard to avoid them.
But you've given us this great stack of source material, articles, bits of research that really goes deeper than the usual story.
Yeah, there's a lot beneath the surface.
So our mission today is to really dig into those sources, pull out the surprising stuff, the stories you don't always hear, the human side of his pretty incredible and complex life. We're kind of leaving the physics textbook on the shelf and looking at his personal world, those famous quirks, his political views, which were surprisingly outspoken, and some decisions he made that are, well, unexpected.
And it's all coming straight from the material provided.
Exactly. Everything we talk about is grounded in those sources you gave us.
Okay, let's unpack this legend.
Sounds good. I mean, you're right. When you think scientist, he's probably top of the list for most people.
Sure. And the basic facts the sources confirm are straightforward. Born March 14th, 1879, Ulm, Germany. Died April 18th, 1955, over in Princeton, New Jersey.
Right.
He had German, Swiss, and American citizenship, Jewish background.
Oh.
And yes, definitely seen as one of history's most important theoretical physicists. No debate there.
But, right off the bat, the sources throw in something that kind of made me pause. This genius. Well, he wasn't exactly a shoo-in for university at first.
No, that's one of those great little details from the material, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources mentioned back in 1895, he tried to get into the University of Zurich, took the entrance exam.
Okay.
And yeah, he passed math and physics. Probably not a huge shocker there.
Right.
Expected. But the sources say he actually failed all the other subjects.
All of them? Seriously?
Yep. Apparently wasn't seen as a particularly strong student overall back then. And he was quite young, too, for university.
Huh.
So because of that, the sources explained he actually had to go back and do a whole extra year of school, like preparation, before he finally got in the next time around.
Wow. Okay, that's fascinating. So the man who'd rethink the cosmos basically failed his college entrance exam first time around.
Pretty much. It does add a layer, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of layers, the sources also highlight some of his, let's say, distinctive personal habits, like his approach to socks, or lack thereof.
Yes, the feet.
Yeah.
The sources definitely note his intense dislike for socks.
Intense dislike.
Apparently, yeah. It started when he was about 16. Seems his big toes kept wearing holes in them.
Relatable problem, actually.
Right. So he reportedly just wanted almost like a little experiment. What would actually happen if he stopped wearing them? And the sources claim, well, nothing bad happened, so that was it. Decision made. Apparently never wore socks again after that.
So, done with socks. Brilliant, kind of.
Yeah.
And the hair, that famous hair.
Also mentioned, the sources say he really disliked getting haircuts. He actually liked that messy, kind of sloppy look.
Explains all the photos, then.
It does. And the sources even mention that there were rumors these kinds of things, the socks, the hair, these personal quirks, might have even played a part in his divorce from his first wife, Mileva Maric, alongside his affairs, which are also mentioned.
Wow. Okay, the sources aren't pulling punches on the personal front.
No, they get quite detailed.
These things, the academic stumble, the socks, the hair, even the rumors about his marriage, it really starts to humanize him, doesn't it? Takes him off the pedestal a bit.
It paints a much fuller picture,
Yeah.
Definitely. Shows that massive intellect doesn't always mean, conventional living.
Not at all. And the sources dive pretty deep into his relationships, too.
They do. We learned quite a bit about his marriages.
His first wife, Mileva Maric, met her in Zurich, right?
Yeah.
While studying.
That's right. And the sources mentioned his parents weren't exactly thrilled, apparently because she was Catholic and also a few years older than him.
Ah, family drama, even for Einstein.
Seems so. The sources say they actually had their first child before they got married, then 2 more kids during the marriage.
Okay.
But ultimately, the sources report the relationship broke down mainly because of Einstein's affairs. He wasn't faithful.
And after Mileva?
After that marriage ended, the sources tell us he married his cousin, Elsa Einstein.
His cousin?
Yes. The material notes they'd been quite close for years before they married. It also specifically states they didn't have any children together, and then adds this rather blunt comment, which is probably for the best.
Oof. The sources are quite frank there.
Very direct.
So what do these details, the messy end of the first marriage, marrying his cousin, what does that tell us about his life outside the lab? It feels complicated.
It definitely shows a side of him that wasn't straightforward or, well, maybe not always admirable by conventional standards.
Right.
And this complexity, this willingness to go against the grain, it seems to carry over into his political life, too. The sources really emphasize that he didn't just stick to science.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting in the sources. He moves to America before World War II, escaping the Nazis, essentially.
Right, escaping that strict German regime.
But the sources make a clear point. Once he was in the U.S., he didn't just, keep his head down. He got involved. He spoke out.
That's a key takeaway from the material. He absolutely engaged in political discussions, public commentary, unlike a lot of scientists, maybe.
And what were his stances, according to the sources?
Well, they say he publicly warned people not to blindly follow authority figures. He also spoke out against patriotism, didn't really believe in it.
Okay, so potentially controversial views, especially at that time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And despite, everything America arguably owed him scientifically, the sources indicate the U.S. authorities were wary. They didn't fully trust him.
And this leads to the FBI surveillance the sources mention.
Exactly. The material states the FBI watched him for over 20 years.
20 years. What was the justification given in the sources?
The main reason cited in the sources is actually quite specific. It apparently stemmed from a comment he made suggesting a country like Switzerland showed more respect for its citizens than America did.
Just that comment.
Well, that combined with his other views. The sources explained that the FBI basically suspected him of being a communist and a radical. Terms used pretty broadly back then for anyone seen as maybe subversive or too critical.
And that was enough for decades of surveillance.
Apparently so, according to the sources. It paints this picture of him being willing to speak his mind, even as a refugee, and facing government scrutiny because of it. His nonconformity wasn't just personal quirks.
Absolutely. And this willingness to engage, driven by, fear, as the sources report, it leads into that really complex, heavily debated part of his story, the atomic bomb.
Yeah. And the sources lay this out very directly. They state flatly, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt.
The famous letter.
The famous letter. Urging FDR to develop atomic bombs for America. Hand them over to America.
And the sources are clear on why he did it.
Yeah, very clear. His motivation, according to the material, was fear. Simple as that. He was terrified the Nazis were ahead in the race to build an atomic bomb.
He saw Hitler as a major threat.
The sources call Hitler one of his great arch enemies. And Einstein knew the Germans were working on atomic research.
So his goal with the letter, as reported in the sources,
was specifically for America to develop a powerful bomb to use against Germany. That was the target.
Okay. And the bombs were developed?
They were. But, and this is crucial in the sources' account, they were never used against Hitler or Germany.
Right.
Instead, as the sources state, the attacks were on Japan, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki.
And what do the sources say about Einstein's reaction after that?
This is really significant. The sources state it was only after seeing the devastation caused by the bombs in Japan. Only then did he fully grasp the horror of what had been unleashed.
So his perspective shifted.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
He then became, according to the sources, one of the leading scientific voices calling for nuclear weapons not to be used anymore, pleading for control.
So the sources show this arc, advocating for the bomb out of fear of a specific enemy, then recoiling in horror and advocating against it once he saw its actual use.
Precisely. It really highlights the immense weight on scientists whose work had such terrifying real-world power, and how perspectives can evolve when faced with those consequences.
Wow. Okay, shifting gears a bit, the sources also touch on some really striking decisions he made later in life. Less global politics, more personal, like an offer he got from Israel in '52.
Yes. The sources note his strong connection to Israel, partly, of course, because of his Jewish heritage.
And in 1952, Israel's president died.
Right. And the sources state that the Israeli government actually wanted Albert Einstein to become their new president.
Yeah, presidency.
Of a country. Yep. The sources say all he needed to do was become an Israeli citizen, and the job was his.
That's an incredible offer. I mean, who turns that down?
Well, Einstein did. The sources describe his reasoning very clearly. He declined.
Why, according to the sources?
His reasoning, reportedly, was all about self-awareness. He felt he just didn't have the right skills, lacked the experience, the talent for dealing with people in that official capacity, for handling state occasions.
He thought he'd be bad at it.
Essentially, yes. He apparently didn't want to disappoint the Israeli people by being a poor president, so he preferred to just pass on the opportunity entirely.
Turning down a presidency because you think you wouldn't be good enough at the ceremonial parts. That says a lot about his priorities, maybe, and how he saw himself versus his public image.
It really does suggest a deep sense of knowing his own limitations, or at least where his strengths really lay, and sticking to that.
And that kind of clear-eyed perspective seems to carry right through to the very end of his life, based on the source's account of his final days in 1955.
Yeah, the sources describe how he became ill, went to the hospital.
And the diagnosis.
Doctors found a burst blood vessel near his heart, internal bleeding, a very serious situation.
But fixable.
The sources state that the doctors believed it was fixable. With surgery, they could repair the vessel.
Okay, so there was a medical option.
There was. However, according to the sources, Einstein flat out refused the operation.
He refused life-saving surgery. Why?
His reasoning, as reported in the sources, is pretty profound. He basically said he felt he'd lived long enough. He was ready to go.
Wow.
And he found the idea of prolonging life artificially. Used the word tasteless. He said it was tasteless to just make life longer in an artificial way.
So he chose acceptance over intervention?
It seems so. And as a direct result of refusing the surgery, the sources state, he passed away in 1955.
That final choice. It offers such a stark insight into his philosophy on life, death, dignity, maybe.
A very powerful moment described in the sources.
And while he died, his most famous organ, according to the sources, had a rather unusual afterlife. His brain.
Ah, yes, the brain. The sources report it was removed and preserved just about 7.5 hours after he died.
But kept secret.
For a long time, yeah. Apparently, it wasn't publicly announced for 23 years.
And the reason for taking it, the sources say?
Pretty straightforward. He was considered possibly the smartest person on Earth. So researchers wanted to study his brain to see if they could find a physical reason why. The biological basis of genius.
Did they find anything? What do the sources say about the studies?
Well, the sources mentioned some findings that have been reported over the years. For example, research from 2012 apparently claimed his prefrontal cortex. The bit involved in planning and complex thought was larger than average. And some older research reportedly suggested he had more glial cells, which are like the support cells in the brain.
Okay, so some potential differences noted.
Potential differences. And the sources are very clear about this. There's a lot of criticism surrounding this research.
Why the criticism?
Several reasons given in sources. Often, the studies compared his brain to only a very small number of other brains. And maybe most importantly, the researchers knew they were looking at Einstein's brain.
Ah, so observer bias.
Exactly. Knowing is Einstein's brain could unconsciously influence how you interpret what you see. So the sources really stress these limitations.
That's a really important caveat the sources provide. We want to find the secret sauce of genius in the physical brain. But the reality of doing that kind of research, especially on one unique brain, it's tricky.
Very tricky. It leaves big questions about what we can genuinely conclude.
Yeah. And speaking of his genius and contributions, the sources reveal something really quite surprising about his most famous work and the Nobel Prize.
Oh yeah, this is a great detail. So his theory of relativity, unquestionably his most famous discovery, right?
Absolutely. Changed everything. The sources say it turned science upside down.
Right. And it brought him huge public attention, which, incidentally, the sources say he didn't particularly like.
Okay. But the Nobel.
Here's the kicker from the sources. He did not win the Nobel Prize for the theory of relativity.
Wait, really? Not for relativity? That seems crazy.
It does, doesn't it? But no, that wasn't why he got the prize.
So, what did he win it for, according to the sources?
The sources state he won the Nobel Prize for an essay he wrote about something called the photoelectric effect.
The photoelectric effect? I mean, okay.
Exactly. It's much less known to the public. But the sources explain that for scientists at the time, it was a huge deal. It apparently clarified a major problem they were struggling with.
So the Nobel Committee rewarded him for solving a specific, pressing scientific puzzle rather than for the grand, revolutionary theory.
That's what the sources suggest, yes.
Yeah.
It shows how scientific recognition can work sometimes, valuing the solution to a known problem very highly. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is unexpected. And finally, the sources give us a little insight into who he looked up to, his own scientific hero.
Yeah, they mentioned Galileo.
Galileo. Makes sense, I suppose. Pioneer.
The sources explicitly state Galileo was his great example, his favorite scientist.
And why Galileo, according to the material?
Well, the sources explain that Galileo, way back in the 16th century, actually laid some of the groundwork, some conceptual foundations for relativity.
Oh, interesting. That far back.
And beyond the science, the sources portray Galileo as a rebel, someone whose ideas went against the established beliefs of his time.
Challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And the sources say Einstein really drew inspiration from that rebellious spirit when he was developing his own revolutionary ideas.
And the sources mentioned they had other things in common, too, besides the science.
Yeah, apparently they had similar views on nationalism. Neither were big fans. And the sources say they both sort of like to kick against the established order.
Rebels united across the centuries.
Something like that. Understanding that connection to Galileo, as the sources lay it out, it kind of helps contextualize Einstein's own willingness to think differently and challenge everything.
Definitely. So, okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've gone through the sources you provided, and wow, it's a much more human, messy, complicated picture of Einstein than just the icon, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We've seen the early academic struggles, the weird habits like the socks, the very public political stands that got him watched by the FBI.
His really complex role in pushing for the atomic bomb and then regretting it.
Turning down a presidency, refusing surgery at the end.
The whole strange story with his brain after death, the Nobel Prize not being for relativity.
And finding his inspiration in a fellow rebel like Galileo. It's a lot.
It is. And the goal here was really just to synthesize what was in those sources you shared to try and build that richer, more detailed portrait.
And it certainly does that. So as you sit with all this information, all these details drawn directly from the sources, here's maybe a final thought. The sources reveal this person of almost unimaginable genius who was also full of contradictions, right?
Seems that way.
A rebel who ended up influencing governments, a pacifist who played a key role in initiating the atomic age, a global celebrity who, according to the sources, rejected power, didn't seem to want fame, wasn't fussed about convention. So based on everything we've dug into today from your sources, how do you make sense of all these different, sometimes clashing parts of Albert Einstein? What one detail, what aspect revealed in these sources makes you see him differently now?